So to begin discussing this, I want to present the sort of end product and go from there. So to understand how all the steps work together, I find it helpful to see how the pieces go together and understand what the different parts we're referring to are. So when we're talking about bringing this into Taleweaver, we need 4 components. Well, we really need 3 components, or just 2. There's a priority here. You can just start with 1. The highest priority is your mesh. So your mesh should be a low poly mesh. The Taleweaver Lite guide says to keep it under 60K vertices so it can work with it. So I'm going to just pull up the default mesh. Now, if you pull up the default mesh in Taleweaver, you'll notice that it looks kind of blurry and gummy. We're going to talk about why that is. But essentially, this is the smoothed, faceted mesh. People talk about polygons adding detail, and that's true in a lot of circumstances. But in digital sort of assets, it's not as simple as polys equaling detail. That is true in 3D printing, but it isn't true in this environment because we get those details through other things called normal map. So if we're looking at this particular item, and I pull up the mesh here, you'll see in this corner, you can actually see the polygons for the mesh. So if we're looking here, you can see these are the polygons. And you see that there's not that many. If you're looking over here, it looks all smoothed out. That's because it's doing an auto smooth effect on it, and we'll talk about that later. The second component is our normal map. Now, the normal map tells the system what to sort of extrapolate from those facets. You can think about it as if you take a flat surface and it sort of balloons out from there. So if we select the normal map, we see how it immediately becomes much, much more detailed. And I'll show you how this looks in Blender as well. We can also see that it's added the keys to the keyboard. So if you look here, you'll notice there are no keys on the mesh for the low poly mesh, but there are keys here. So when we talk about what details are needed in the high poly and low poly meshes, or sorry, in your sort of what comes out in the normal texture, what's actually in the low poly, you can see that here on the shoulder, there's not the details that are here. You can see here on the keyboard, there are not the details that are there. Those are added by the normal map or the normal texture, and I'll show you that in Blender as well. The next component after those 2 components is your color. And that's the albedo texture, and I'm butchering that pronunciation, but it's a word I haven't heard anyone ever speak, so we'll just go with that. And I'll just say color texture because that's what it is. If we grab that, now we're seeing the colors applied. So that's simple. That we think about that as just the paint job. So this is now we've got the normal map, which gives the depth. We've got the color, which obviously gives us our color. The last one is metallic AO roughness. This in some systems is called the PBR. Blender handles these in a different way, and it's probably one of the more complicated steps. We'll talk about why that is, but I'm also going to say that it is the least necessary component of these. If you're setting up your color texture in a way that has some depth to it, you will not need to have this at all. So let's apply the one that it has. So there's that. So what you see that this does is it applies the metallics, ambient occlusion, and roughness. So the ambient occlusion, you'll notice, gives some depth of shadow that was not present without it. So if I take that away, you'll notice that things are a lot brighter before we add this. And then once we add this, oh, sorry, grabbed the wrong one. I grabbed the color texture, grab that. We notice that the shadows are a bit deepened. This can also be achieved on your color. We'll talk about that a bit more. The other thing you'll notice are the metallics. So if I go, this is a little tricky to show, here on the gun, you'll see that there's some metallic elements, and that is probably the primary thing that this is doing for us, is giving us that light and those, oh, wrong one again, those details there. So it affects the lighting and it affects the way metallics are. All right. So I say that's the least important because, as I'll show you in another example, you can get a very good mesh and a very good overall effect without adding this at all. So yep, I've even got that set to none right now, and that's still a good many. And adding that back on, and it does make it pop a bit, but I wouldn't stress over it. We'll talk about how to sort of work around it if you're having trouble getting it together, and that is sort of our goal. So Now let's talk about what these actually end up looking like in Blender. So what I've done is I've taken that same file from the Taleweaver and I've brought it into Blender. And I've also made copies of it. We'll talk about that. You've got sort of a space over here where you can see the items in your sort of window. When you load it in, if you were to load what's called an FBX model or an object, a lot of times it'll come in like this where it is already got a shade smooth on it. So I've made a second copy so you can see what the polygons look like when it's not shaded smooth. So that's showing the actual polys of the item. You can also see that it's the same if we go to what's called like a wireframe view. So this is the sort of the normal view. Here's your wireframe view, and you can see that these are the exact same wireframes. So same poly count for each object, and there's that. The next step is adding that normal texture. And I've got in Blender, you're like, wait, that doesn't look like anything's been added because of the different viewports. So you have a wireframe, you have the next one, which is solids, and the next one, which is the material preview, which shows applied materials like a normal map. And so we can see that here. Now this makes it harder to see these two. That's why I left it in the other light. So now we can see that's with the normal map applied. And the next one is with the normal map and the color applied. And you'll see it looks kind of garish in here because we don't have the dynamic lighting that exists in Taleweaver, so it ends up looking very, very flat, and that's okay. It sort of gives you an idea of what to expect when you're doing some basic paint. And then the last one is it with the metallic and roughness applied, not ambient occlusion. There's a reason for that in Blender. Part of it is that Blender does the lighting differently and makes it difficult to pull and push ambient occlusion. I can't just plug it into a socket. We'll talk about some ways that I work around that to make the workflow simpler. In the shading browser, which is where we'll be doing some of our work to get normal maps applied and color applied, you'll learn that it gets very complicated very quickly. There are different methods for dealing with that complexity, but we're going to try to keep it simple for purposes of these videos and making sure that it's just easy to follow along for the basics that you need to do. You don't need to learn all of Blender. You don't need to know how all the things work, but kind of to get you started so that you can make these sort of minis work in Taleweaver and in the Unity engine, but not get so complicated that you get bogged down on one part. So now we're going to swap over to actually working in a new Blender file with a model that we've taken, that we want to take from a high poly model, reduce to low poly, and put through sort of this process that you see in front of you.